Imagine you survived a war that lasted 10 years. A war that swallowed thousands of men whole. Their names, their faces, their futures gone forever into fire and ash and the dark memory of the sea. Imagine that war is finally over. You have won. And now all you want, the only thing left that matters, is to go home. Home is a small island, a rocky kingdom perched at the edge of the western Greek world. You can practically smell it from the shores of Troy. By all reasonable calculation, by every favorable wind and steady current of the ancient Aegean, you should be home in a matter of weeks. But you will not get home in weeks. You will not get home in months. It will take you 10 years. And when you finally arrive, the man who left will barely resemble the man who returns. This is not merely a story about one man lost at sea. This is a story about what it costs a human being to survive the impossible, about the price of pride, about the cruelty of gods, the loyalty of love, and the terrifying, beautiful stubbornness of the human will to endure. According to Homer's Odyssey, one of the oldest, most influential works of literature ever created, this is the story of Odysseus of Ithaca. And nearly 3,000 years later, we are still listening. Part 1. The world that made the Odyssey. To understand the Odyssey, we first have to understand the world from which it was born. The ancient Greek world of the late Bronze Age, roughly 1600 to 1200 BCE, was a civilization of extraordinary power and sophistication. The Mycenaean Greeks, as archaeologists now call them, built fortified palaces with massive stone walls at places like Mycenae, Sirens, and Pylos. They traded across the eastern Mediterranean. They were literate, organized, and formidably warlike. Archaeological evidence at these sites reveals a culture comfortable with both great beauty, golden death masks, intricate pottery, frescoed walls, and the organized machinery of violence. And then, sometime around 1200 BCE, it all collapsed. What historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most debated catastrophes in ancient history. Within the span of a few decades, palace after palace across Greece and the wider Mediterranean world was abandoned, burned, or simply fell silent. The elaborate administrative systems that had held Mycenaean civilization together vanished. Writing itself disappeared from the Greek world for roughly 4 centuries. What followed was a period scholars called the Greek Dark Ages, a long twilight of reduced populations, lost knowledge, and fading memory. It is into this twilight that the stories of the Odyssey were born. Many historians believe the tales of Odysseus, the Trojan War, and the great wandering heroes began as oral traditions, stories passed from singer to singer, generation to generation, through the long darkness after Mycenae fell. They carried memories of a grander, more heroic age that ordinary people could no longer fully see or touch, only imagine. The epic poem we know as the Odyssey was most likely composed in its surviving written form sometime in the 8th or 7th century BCE, possibly by a poet named Homer, possibly by a tradition of poets working within the same school of oral verse-making. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Homer was a single historical individual, a convenient collective name, or something more complex. What we do know with confidence is that the text was composed in a sophisticated form of ancient Greek, structured in dactylic hexameter, the grand rolling meter of Greek epic poetry, and was considered a cornerstone of Greek literary culture by at least the mid-5th century BCE. The Odyssey draws on real geography, Real seas, real islands, real wind patterns of the Mediterranean, blended with supernatural invention and mythological tradition. Some scholars have proposed ancient equivalents for legendary locations, the whirlpool Charybdis perhaps echoing the treacherous straits of Messina between Sicily and Italy, the island of Circe possibly inspired by real coastal territories of the western Mediterranean. Most historians are careful to note that the poem is not a travel guide, it is a mythological epic, a fusion of legend, moral philosophy, and poetic imagination that used the real world as a canvas. The Iliad, Homer's other great epic, tells the story of the final year of the Trojan War. The Odyssey begins where the Iliad ends, in the smoldering ruins of a fallen city. We need to go there first, because before there can be a journey home, there must be a reason to leave.
Part 2. The War That Started Everything. According to Greek tradition, the city of Troy stood on a strategic promontory on the northwestern coast of what is now Turkey, near the mouth of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that connects the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. It was a position of immense commercial and military importance. Whoever controlled the Hellespont controlled the flow of trade between two worlds. Ancient legend says the Trojan War began over a woman, the beautiful Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, who was either taken or seduced away by the Trojan prince Paris. Whether this was abduction or elopement, ancient tradition debated, but the result was not debatable. Menelaus, humiliated and furious, called upon a coalition of Greek kings to sail with him to Troy and take back what had been stolen. It is worth pausing here. Archaeological evidence from the site of Hisarlik in modern Turkey, widely accepted by most scholars as the most plausible candidate for ancient Troy, reveals that the city was burned and destroyed multiple times, with one prominent destruction layer designated Troy 7A, dating to roughly 1180 to 1190 BCE. This corresponds broadly with the general time frame Greek tradition assigns to the Trojan War. Excavations have turned up human skeletal remains, weapon points, and signs of violent destruction. What these finds tell us, as archaeologist Manfred Korfmann and others have argued, is that a real conflict of some kind occurred at this site. Whether it was the vast 10-year siege of legend, with 1,000 ships and the gods themselves choosing sides, is something the historical record cannot confirm. The poem is what we have, and it is extraordinary. The war, Greek tradition tells us, lasted 10 years. 10 years of siege, of battle before the walls, of grief and glory and savage attrition. Finally, according to the legend, it ended not through direct assault on those walls, but through one of the most famous acts of deception in all of mythology, the Trojan horse. And who was it, according to Homer, that conceived of the Trojan horse? Odysseus. Part 3. The Man Called Odysseus. Of all the heroes of the Trojan War, and there were many, colossal in their own traditions, Odysseus stood apart. Not because he was the greatest warrior. That title, in Greek tradition, belonged to Achilles, the near-invincible son of a sea nymph, the most terrifying fighter of his age. Not because he was the most powerful king. That was Agamemnon, commander of the entire coalition. Odysseus was different. He was clever. Homer describes him with a phrase that recurs throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey, polytropos, which translates roughly as a man of many turns, or much traveled, or many-sided. Some scholars read it as a man who has seen much. Others read it as a man who is capable of many forms, adaptable, resourceful, willing to bend truth when the moment demands it. Ancient tradition praises him for his cunning and strategic intelligence. Other ancient voices, including some Greek tragedians, were less charitable, depicting him as manipulative and willing to sacrifice others for personal survival. He was, in other words, a fully human hero, brilliant and flawed, heroic and morally complicated, not a perfect champion, but a survivor. He was the king of Ithaca, a rocky, relatively modest island off the northwestern coast of Greece in what are now called the Ionian Islands. He had a wife, Penelope, renowned in Greek tradition for her loyalty and intelligence. He had a son, Telemachus, who was an infant when Odysseus sailed for Troy. According to the epic, Odysseus had not wanted to go. Ancient tradition tells us that he feigned madness to avoid conscription, plowing a field and sowing it with salt, pretending to be insane, before the ruse was seen through and he was forced to join the fleet. He sailed anyway. He fought for 10 years. He helped win the war. And then, when it was finally over, when every other king turned his ships toward home, Odysseus turned his too. He would not arrive for another decade. The question that have gripped readers for nearly 3,000 years is simple, haunting, and impossible to fully answer. Why? Part 4. The Curse and the Crossing. The Odyssey gives us an explanation rooted in divine displeasure, specifically the wrath of Poseidon, god of the sea and of earthquakes. According to Homer's account, Odysseus blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, during his wanderings, and Poseidon's rage became a relentless, grinding force against every attempt Odysseus made to reach home. While the supernatural elements of this explanation belong entirely to mythology, the underlying theme is one historians and literary scholars find deeply meaningful. The ancient Greek conception of hubris, dangerous pride that offends divine order, is central to the Odyssey from its first pages. Odysseus's troubles are not purely external. Many of them flow from his own character, his defiance, his hunger for experience and glory, and the devastating consequences of the actions of his men, who do not always share his discipline or foresight. But the journey itself, that vast, terrifying, and astonishing journey, begins simply enough, with a raid.
Chapter 1. The Cicones, victory that cost everything. According to Homer's Odyssey, the first stop of Odysseus's homeward voyage was not a supernatural island or a divine trap. It was something far human and far more consequential. A decision made in the immediate aftermath of war by exhausted, victory-drunk soldiers who should have known better. After leaving the ruins of Troy, Odysseus and his 12 ships landed at Ismaros, the city of the Cicones, a Thracian people allied with Troy on the coast of what is now northern Greece or southern Thrace. Their men sacked the city. They killed, plundered, and then, crucially, refused to leave. Odysseus himself, according to the text, urged them to sail immediately. They did not listen. They feasted on the beach, drank the Cicones wine, and celebrated through the night, like men who had just won a decade-long war and could not believe it was over. By dawn, the Cicones had called for reinforcements. Mounted warriors came from the inland, more numerous, better rested, and absolutely furious. What followed was a rout. Odysseus's men scrambled to their ships under a devastating assault. When the ships finally broke free and he counted the survivors, 6 men from each ship were gone. 72 men, dead in one morning. Not killed by monsters or the wrath of gods, killed by the refusal to listen, killed by the inability to leave a war behind, even when the war was won. It is a devastating beginning, and in the tradition of the ancient Greek epic, it establishes something immediately.
The men who sail with Odysseus are not simply background figures. They are individuals who make choices, and their choices will matter enormously before this story is done. The fleet sailed on, battered and diminished. A great storm from Zeus hammered them for 2 days and nights. When the sea finally released them, they found themselves carried far to the south and west, blown away from the familiar waters of home. And then they found the island of the Lotus Eaters. Chapter 2: The Lotus Eaters, the Seduction of Forgetting. Ancient legend describes the land of the Lotus Eaters as a place of seductive, paralyzing peace. When Odysseus sent 3 of his men ashore to scout, they were received not with violence, but with hospitality. They were offered food, a kind of lotus plant whose consumption had one devastating effect. They forgot. They forgot the ships. They forgot Troy. They forgot Ithaca. They forgot that they were supposed to want to go home. Greek tradition tells us they sat in a dreaming contentment on that foreign shore, entirely unwilling to return, weeping when Odysseus finally dragged them bodily back to the ships. Many modern scholars read this episode not as literal botany, but as a profound psychological metaphor, one of the first in Western literature. The lotus represents the allure of forgetting, of abandoning the painful effort of striving toward a goal. The men on that island did not suffer. They felt no fear, no grief, no exhaustion, and that was precisely the danger. To forget your purpose in the moral world of the Odyssey is to cease to be fully human. Odysseus tied his 3 men to the rowing benches and ordered the fleet to sea immediately, ordering every man, on pain of his anger, not to touch the lotus. The first real temptation had been survived. But on the horizon, through sea haze and the crash of waves, rose a darker island, and somewhere from that island, in the nights that followed, came a sound no scouting party had expected to hear. Something enormous was singing. Chapter 3: Polyphemus, the Price of Curiosity. The episode of the Cyclops Polyphemus is, in many ways, the pivotal chapter of the entire Odyssey, not merely because of its drama, which is extraordinary, but because of the decision Odysseus makes at its conclusion, a decision that will haunt every single day of the 10 years that follow. According to Homer's account, Odysseus and 12 of his best men went ashore on the island of the Cyclopes, beings described in the text as enormous, one-eyed, lawless, and contemptuous of the gods. They found a massive cave stocked with cheeses, pens full of lambs and goat kids, wooden pails brimming with fresh milk. Odysseus's men urged him immediately to take what they could carry and leave. He refused. Curiosity held him. He wanted to see whose cave this was. That decision cost lives. The Cyclops, Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, according to Greek tradition, returned and sealed the cave with a boulder no 20 men could move. When he discovered the intruders, he asked who they were. Odysseus told him they were sailors and invoked xenia, the sacred Greek code of hospitality to strangers, a concept of enormous cultural importance in the ancient world. Polyphemus was unmoved. He seized 2 of Odysseus's men, dashed their heads against the cave floor, and ate them. The trap was total. The boulder sealed all exits. Direct violence against Polyphemus was impossible. If they killed him, they could never move the stone. So Odysseus thought. And this is where the character of Odysseus reaches its full complexity, because what follows is not brute force. It is a plan of layered deception, requiring patience, nerve, and cold calculation while men are dying around him. He found a massive wooden stake in the cave. He
He sharpened it to a point in secret while Polyphemus slept. He got the giant drunk on the strong wine he had brought from the ships, a wine of extraordinary potency, diluted usually 1 part to 20 before drinking, but offered here undiluted. When Polyphemus, slurring and enormous, asked Odysseus his name, Odysseus told him, "Nobody. Utis, nobody." When the stake was driven into the sleeping Cyclops' single eye, and Polyphemus screamed and roared for help from his fellow Cyclopes, they called out asking who had hurt him. "Nobody," he screamed, "nobody is killing me." And they went back to their caves, concluding he must be suffering some divine illness beyond help. Odysseus and his surviving men escaped by hiding beneath the bellies of Polyphemus' sheep as the blinded monster released them to pasture. They reached the ships, and then Odysseus made a terrible mistake. As the ships pulled away, he could not resist. From a safe distance, or what he thought was a safe distance, he shouted back to the Cyclops, not just his taunts, but his real name, Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes. He needed Polyphemus to know who had outwitted him. It is one of the most psychologically revealing moments in all ancient literature, and one of the most catastrophic, because Polyphemus, blinded and raging, lifted his hands to his father Poseidon and prayed, "Let Odysseus of Ithaca never reach home, or if fate requires it, let him arrive late, alone, his companions all dead, on a stranger's ship, to find only sorrow waiting." According to Greek tradition, Poseidon heard. Everything that follows in the Odyssey, every storm, every setback, every death, echoes with the sound of that prayer.
Chapter 4. Aeolus and the Bag of Winds. Greek tradition tells us that after the horror of Polyphemus' island, Odysseus' reduced fleet found a miraculous and generous reception from Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, who lived on a floating island called Aeolia with his 12 children. Aeolus listened to Odysseus' stories for an entire month and sent him away with an extraordinary gift, a great leather bag in which he had sealed every contrary and dangerous wind, leaving only the west wind free to carry the ships toward Ithaca. They sailed for 9 days. On the 10th day, within sight of Ithaca, close enough to see the watchfires on the shore, Odysseus finally slept, exhausted from watching over the bag himself. His men, suspicious and jealous, had spent those 9 days whispering. Surely the bag contained gold and silver, riches from Aeolus that Odysseus was hoarding for himself. Surely this was not fair, after everything they had suffered together. They would just take a look. They opened the bag, every wind howled free at once. The sea erupted. The fleet was flung violently backward away from Ithaca in a screaming gale that lasted until the ships found themselves once again at Aeolia. When Odysseus begged Aeolus for help a second time, the king's mood had darkened completely. A man twice driven from his own shores was clearly cursed by the gods, and no sane person helped a man the gods had turned against. He sent Odysseus away. The fleet sailed on now in silence, no divine winds to speed them, only oars and exhaustion and the weight of what had been lost so close, so agonizingly close, to home. They were about to find out that the next stop on their journey would be even worse. Chapter 5. The Laestrygonians, the worst day. According to Homer's Odyssey, the Laestrygonians were cannibalistic, giants who lived in a land where day and night barely distinguished themselves, a detail some scholars find intriguing for its possible astronomical implications about far northern latitudes, though most interpret it as mythological invention, describing a world beyond civilization's edge. Odysseus, characteristically cautious this time, anchored his own ship outside the narrow harbor. The rest of the fleet, 11 ships, sailed inside into the sheltered, cliff-enclosed bay. It was a trap. The Laestrygonians threw boulders from the cliffs. Enormous rocks crashed through hulls, capsized ships, crushed men in the water. And then the giants waded in, spearing the survivors like fish and carrying them away to eat. 11 ships, all 11 ships, every crew gone. Only Odysseus' single ship survived because it was anchored outside. He cut the anchor cable and ordered his men to row. Row or die. They rowed. One ship remained from the proud fleet of 12 that had sailed from Troy. Fewer than 50 men remained from an expedition of hundreds. The losses were catastrophic, almost incomprehensible. They rowed until they could row no more, and they pulled the ship onto the shore of a wooded island and lay on the beach for 2 days and nights, utterly unable to move, paralyzed not by enchantment this time, by grief. When Odysseus finally forced himself upright on the morning of the 3rd day, he climbed to a high point and looked across the island's interior. Somewhere in the deep forest, he could see a wisp of smoke rising. Someone, or something, lived here. Chapter 6. Circe, the Witch of Aeaea. The island of Aeaea, according to Greek tradition, was the home of Circe, a goddess or sorceress. The distinction in ancient Greek cosmology was sometimes fluid. Daughter of the sun god Helios and the Oceanid Perse. Ancient legend describes her as beautiful, dangerous, and possessed of profound magical knowledge. When Odysseus sent a scouting party led by his second-in-command, Eurylochus, to investigate the smoke, they found Circe's palace surrounded by wolves and lions, animals that behaved disturbingly, not with aggression but with docility, rubbing against the men's legs like domesticated creatures. Circe herself could be heard inside, singing while she worked at her loom. She invited the men in. She fed them. She gave them wine, and then she struck them with her wand and turned every man except Eurylochus, who had stayed outside, suspicious, into pigs. Eurylochus fled back to Odysseus in terror. What followed is one of the most distinctive moments in the entire poem. Odysseus, hearing what had happened, immediately turned toward the forest to go alone into Circe's hall. On the way, according to the text, he was met by Hermes, divine messenger, protector of travelers and thieves, who gave him a magical herb called moly to counteract Circe's magic, and precise instructions for what to do. Armed with the herb and with his sword, Odysseus received Circe's drugged wine, felt nothing, and held his blade to her throat. Circe recognized him immediately. Ancient tradition holds that she had been warned by a prophecy that a man of extraordinary cunning would one day resist her power. She had been waiting. She restored his men from their pig form. She became an ally, and then, in one of the stranger elements of the epic, Odysseus and his men remained on Aeaea for a full year. Some scholars read this not merely as weakness or enchantment, but as a necessary interval, a period of recovery. After the catastrophic losses of the Laestrygonians, a breathing space before the even more terrifying journey to come. Whatever the interpretation, it is Odysseus's men who eventually remind him that it is time to go. It is time to try once more to go home. Circe does not stop them, but she gives Odysseus a warning. Before he can sail for Ithaca, he must first travel to a place that no living man has ever gone and returned from. He must go down to the land of the dead. Chapter 7. The Underworld. Voices from Below. The journey to the Underworld, what Homer calls the Nakia in Book Epines of the Odyssey, stands as one of the most remarkable literary achievements of the ancient world. It is a sequence so resonant, so profoundly imagined, that its influence on everything from Virgil's Aeneid to Dante's Inferno to countless works of modern literature is impossible to overstate. According to Homer's account, Odysseus followed Circe's instructions precisely. He sailed north to the edge of the world, to the land of the Cimmerians, where mist and darkness reign and the sun never shines. He dug a pit. He made offerings, dark-fleeced sheep, poured libations of honey, milk, wine, and water. and waited. The shades of the dead came to the blood offerings. Flickering, insubstantial, they clustered at the pit's edge. First, the shade of Elpenor, one of Odysseus's own men, who had died that very morning on Aeaea, fallen drunk from Circe's roof, his neck broken in the fall, unburied, his death as yet unknown to his companions. His shade begged for burial rites. Odysseus promised them. Then came the shade of his own mother, Anticlea, who had died of grief waiting for her son to return. 3 times Odysseus reached out to embrace her. 3 times his arms passed through nothing. Her shade told him, "This is the way of mortals when they die. The sinews no longer hold flesh and bones together. It is one of the most desolating moments in the epic, a man reaching for his dead mother in the dark and finding only air." Then Tiresias, the blind Theban prophet, the most famous oracle of Greek tradition, came forward and delivered the warning Odysseus had crossed the world to receive. Poseidon's anger was unrelenting. The cattle of Helios on the island of Thrinacia must not be touched, must not be harmed, no matter what. If any of his men killed even one of those sacred animals, none of them would see home again. And even after surviving all of this, Odysseus would arrive on Ithaca to find problems waiting. Suitors devouring his household, threatening his wife and his kingdom. Tiresias told him what to do. He told him what lay ahead. And then the shade of the great prophet faded back into the dark. After him came others. Achilles, greatest of the Greek heroes, now dead, was here in the gloom. And when Odysseus told him how honored his name remained among the living, Achilles answered with devastating honesty. He would rather be a hired hand, working the fields of the poorest farmer among the living, than rule over all the dead. It is a declaration that shocked ancient readers as much as modern ones. The most famous warrior in Greek history. Preferring humble life to glorious death, Agamemnon came, murdered by his own wife on his return from Troy, and warned Odysseus to be careful, to trust no woman completely, to return home in secret rather than in triumph. The shades pressed in. Odysseus could bear no more. He fled back to his ship. He carried something with him out of that dark place, something that no journey through beautiful islands and enchanted seas could have given him. He carried the full, terrible weight of what was at stake. He knew now what he was racing against. He knew what was waiting in Ithaca. He had to get home. Chapter 8. The Sirens, the last beautiful trap. Circe had warned him about everything that lay between Aeaea and Thrinacia. She laid it all out, with the precision of a general briefing, a commander before a battle, where every wrong move means death. First, the Sirens. According to Greek tradition, the Sirens were creatures variously described as women or as bird women, or in some later traditions as mermaids, whose singing was not merely beautiful, but irresistible and lethal. Every ship that had ever passed their island had run aground on the rocks below, the sailors diving in a trance toward the source of that voice, forgetting everything, oars, steering, the need to breathe. The shore of their island was white, according to the text, not with sand, but with the bones of men and the rotting hulls of ships. Odysseus wanted to hear them. This is a crucial detail. He could have simply sailed past with every man's ears stopped with beeswax, hearing nothing. He chose instead to be tied to the mast, rope around his chest, wrists bound, while his crew, deafened by wax, rowed on. He listened to the Sirens' song, whatever it was, in full consciousness, completely unable to act on the desire it ignited. In the metaphorical grammar of the Odyssey, this is Odysseus at his most fully developed, a man who wants to experience everything the world offers, but has learned, through catastrophe, to constrain that hunger before it destroys him. He heard the Sirens and survived, not by not listening, by listening helpless. It was the last beautiful trap. The worst was still ahead. Chapter 9. Scylla and Charybdis. The impossible choice, even by the extraordinary standards of what came before. The passage between Scylla and Charybdis stands as perhaps the most agonizing sequence in the entire Odyssey, because for the first time, there is no clever solution. There is no wily trick available. There is no bag of herbs from a friendly god. There is only the choice between two kinds of catastrophe. Charybdis was a whirlpool of mythological dimensions, described in Homer's text as sucking down the dark, water to expose the seabed 3 times a day, then belching it back up in boiling foam. Any ship entering that vortex would be destroyed absolutely and completely. Scylla, on the opposite cliff, was a monster of 6 heads, each with 3 rows of teeth on 6 long necks, lurking in the shadow of the rock face. According to Greek tradition, she snatched sailors from passing ships and ate them, 6 at a time. Some scholars have long suggested that Scylla and Charybdis may preserve a mythologized memory of the Strait of Messina between Sicily and the Italian mainland, a notoriously dangerous passage with treacherous currents that would have been well known to ancient Greek sailors. Most historians treat the supernatural elements as mythological invention, but acknowledge the possibility that real navigational dangers were encoded in legendary form. Circe's advice had been stark. Aim for Scylla's cliff. Sail close, row hard, lose 6 men but save the ship. Because no ship has ever survived Charybdis, Odysseus did not tell his crew what was coming. He knew that if they knew, they would stop rowing in terror. He stood at the bow with his spear, watching the cliff face, as if bronze could protect him against this. The rowers pulled with everything they had, eyes fixed on Charybdis, watching the vortex swirl. They did not see Scylla until the long necks came down. 6 men, lifted screaming from their benches, their hands reaching toward Odysseus as they rose. Homer names none of them here, but he tells us Odysseus could not look away. The ship cleared the strait. The whirlpool churned behind them. 6 men were gone in seconds. Odysseus described it later as the most terrible thing he had ever seen in all his years at sea and war, and they were not done yet. The island of Helios lay directly ahead. Chapter 10, The Cattle of Helios. The breaking point, Thrinacia, the island where Helios, god of the sun, kept his sacred cattle, 7 herds of 50, immortal and untouchable, tended by the god's daughters, Phaethusa and Lampeti. According to Greek tradition, these animals were flawless, white as sea foam, with horns of gold, and their lives were sacred in a way that transcended ordinary prohibition. Tiresias had been explicit. Circe had been explicit. Touch nothing on this island. Odysseus himself begged his men to simply sail past. He knew. He had been warned by 2 separate prophetic sources, from the living and the dead, but the winds had turned against them. A southerly gale trapped the ship on Thrinacia for a month, then longer. They had brought provisions from Circe's island, but those were now exhausted. Hunting and fishing kept them fed, but barely. The men grew gaunt. The cattle were everywhere, beautiful and slow-moving and inexhaustible to the eye. Then one day, Odysseus fell asleep. Eurylochus, the same man who had been the sole survivor of Circe's hall, who had survived more than any of them had a right to expect, spoke to the crew. They were starving, he argued. What was the point of surviving every monster and god they had faced, only to die of hunger within sight of land? The cattle were right there. They would make offerings to Helios, promised to build him a great temple when they reached home, atone for the transgression with devotion. Surely the god would understand. They killed the cattle. When Odysseus woke and saw the smoke of the sacrifice rising into the sky, he knew what had happened with a certainty that went beyond reason. The ground itself seemed to shudder. The skins of the slaughtered cattle began to move. The meat on the spits lowed like living animals. The gods had taken note. For 6 days they stayed on the island. On the 7th the wind changed. They put to sea, and almost immediately a storm of extraordinary violence, Zeus hurling lightning according to the text. The sea erupted in chaos, destroyed the ship completely. Every man died in the wreck except Odysseus. He alone, having eaten none of the cattle, clung to a makeshift raft of mast and keel. Scylla's rock and Charybdis's whirlpool came again. He barely survived by gripping a fig tree above the vortex, dangling above the abyss until the wreckage of his raft came back up. Then dropping back onto it and paddling away, he drifted for 9 days. On the 10th, the sea brought him to an island. On that island, he would stay for 7 years. Chapter 11. Calypso. The deepest exile, Calypso. Her name in ancient Greek means she who conceals, was a divine nymph who lived on the island of Ogygia, alone, at the absolute edge of the known world. Ancient legend tells us she was beautiful beyond ordinary reckoning, that her island was a paradise of fragrant timber, clear springs, and meadows of violet and parsley. She saved Odysseus from the sea, and then she would not let him leave. For 7 years, according to Homer's account, Odysseus lived on Ogygia. Calypso loved him, genuinely, possessively, hopelessly. She offered him everything a mortal man might dream of. Immortality, eternal youth, a life free from war and grief and the grinding terror of the journey. She offered to make him a god every morning. He sat on the cliffs above the sea and wept, staring west toward the home he could not reach. He never stopped wanting to go home. It is one of the most quietly devastating passages in the entire epic. A man offered paradise and refusing it, day after day, year after year, because the paradise he wants is not perfection. It is the ordinary rocky imperfection of Ithaca. It is his wife, his son, his aging father. It is belonging somewhere specific to specific people under a specific sky. The word the Greeks used for this longing, nostos, gives us the modern word nostalgia. But the ancient meaning was sharper and more urgent. It was not merely sentiment. It was a driving force, the central human need to return to one's own place in the world. Scholars note that the Odyssey is, at its structural and emotional core, a poem about this very concept. The desire and the cost of coming home. It was only when the god Hermes was dispatched by Athena, who had never ceased to advocate for Odysseus, to order Calypso to release him, that the 7 years finally ended. Calypso was angry. She protested bitterly that the gods held a double standard, allowing divine women to be separated from their mortal lovers, while divine men kept human companions without consequence. Her protest is noted in the text with what reads as genuine sympathy from Homer. But she obeyed. She helped Odysseus build a raft. She gave him provisions, fresh water, and fair winds. After 7 years of exile and 20 years total away from home, 10 at war, 10 wandering, Odysseus sailed east. Poseidon, returning from Ethiopia and spotting him on the sea, promptly sent another storm. The raft was destroyed. Odysseus swam. Chapter 12. The Phaeacians, the shore of return. He washed ashore on the island of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians, a people of the ancient world whom Greek tradition describes as exceptional sailors, almost supernaturally gifted navigators whose ships moved through the sea with the speed of thought, guided by their own intelligence without need for human steering. Scholars have debated endlessly where, if anywhere, Scheria might correspond to a real place. Corfu is one popular candidate, but the Phaeacians in the poem function most clearly as a threshold people, a civilization existing between the world of monsters and the real world of home. He was discovered by the Phaeacian princess Nausicaa, who was doing laundry at a stream with her handmaids when a naked, salt-encrusted, barely human figure emerged from the bushes of the riverbank. That she did not run, that she spoke to him with composure and dignity, is itself one of the more quietly remarkable moments in the poem. King Alcinous and Queen Arete of the Phaeacians received Odysseus with the exemplary hospitality, xenia, that the world had so frequently denied him. They heard his story. At a great feast, a blind singer named Demodocus sang of the Trojan War, and Odysseus, unrecognized among them, could not stop his tears. It is at this feast that Odysseus finally speaks his own name, the first time in the poem's present action, as opposed to its flashbacks, that he declares who he is. He tells them everything, every chapter of this account. And when he is done, the Phaeacians ask only one thing: what do you need to get home? They loaded a ship with treasure. They laid Odysseus on a bed of blankets and cushions on the deck. And while he slept, their enchanted ship crossed the sea in the darkness. When dawn broke, the ship touched the shore of Ithaca. 20 years. He was home, but he had arrived as Tiresias had promised, into a house that was not safe. For 20 years, Penelope had waited. She had managed Odysseus's household, raised Telemachus alone, administered a kingdom without its king, and held off a gathering tide of men who believed, had very good reason to believe, that Odysseus was dead. The ancient Greek world offered a widow in her position limited protections and limited options. Marriage was politically and economically necessary for the stability of the kingdom, and suitors had arrived according to Greek tradition, numbering 108 men from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, noblemen all, camped in Odysseus's palace, consuming his livestock, drinking his wine, insulting his son, and pressing Penelope to choose one of them as husband and new king. She delayed them with legendary ingenuity. She announced that she would choose a husband when she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father, Laertes. She wove it by day. She unraveled it by night. She kept this up for 3 years before a treacherous handmaid revealed the trick. The suitor's patience, already thin, was nearly exhausted. Odysseus arrived home disguised as a beggar, disguise arranged by Athena, and spent days moving through his own household in anonymity, observing, planning, testing loyalties, containing his rage with an iron discipline that is almost painful to read. His son Telemachus, now 20 years old, no longer the infant Odysseus had left, recognized his father in secret. His old nurse Euryclea, bathing his feet, recognized a scar on his thigh from a boyhood hunting wound. His aged dog Argos, lying on a heap of dung at the palace gate, barely alive, covered in ticks, 20 years old, recognized his master's voice and wagged his tail once before dying. It is the briefest, most shattering scene in the entire epic, occupying perhaps 15 lines of text and producing in readers across 30 centuries the same absolute devastation. The contest of the bow was Penelope's final delay. She announced that she would marry whichever man could string Odysseus's great bow, a weapon of extraordinary power made of ox horn that required massive strength to bend and shoot an arrow through a line of 12 axe heads set in the floor. The suitors tried, one by one. None could even string it. The beggar asked for a try. They laughed. He strung it as easily as a musician strings a lyre. The arrow passed through all 12 axe heads, and then Odysseus turned from the targets to the suitors, and everything that had been held in check for 20 years was released. The battle was brutal, swift, and total. Odysseus, Telemachus, and 2 loyal servants against more than 100 armed men in a closed hall. The text does not spare the reader. Men died screaming, diving behind tables, begging for mercy that was not given. The suitors, who had spent years eating a dead man's food and threatening his family, discovered too late that the dead man had come home. When it was over, the great hall stank of blood. Odysseus had his palace back. He had his son. He had his kingdom. But there was one more door to walk through, the most important one. Chapter 14. Penelope, the final test. Ancient Greek tradition is remarkably careful at this point. Penelope told by Euryclea that the stranger beggar has killed all the suitors and that he is Odysseus, does not simply run to him. She is controlled, reserved, testing. She has been deceived and disappointed too many times. Too many false rumors. Too many men who arrived claiming to have news of Odysseus's whereabouts. She had lived 20 years by her wits, and her wits did not desert her now. She told her servants to move Odysseus's bed into the outer chamber, to set it up there for the stranger to sleep. Odysseus reacted with sudden, passionate anger. He told her that was impossible. That bed could not be moved. It had been built by his own hands, built around a living olive tree rooted in the earth. One of its carved posts was the tree itself, still rooted, still alive. No one could move that bed unless someone had cut away the living wood. He would know if someone had done that. How does she know whether the bed has been violated? Penelope wept and held him, because no one in the world could have known that detail about the bed. No impostor, no god in disguise, only the man who had built it in that room. In the early days of their marriage, in a world that had since been burned down and rebuilt and burned down again, Homer describes Penelope weeping in Odysseus's arms the way a shipwrecked sailor weeps when he sees land. The simile reversed. The sufferer now the one who has been anchored and waiting, rather than the one who has been adrift. It's among the most beautiful and exact reversals in the entire poem, and it says everything about what the Odyssey understands about love and endurance, and what it actually means to come home. Epilogue. Why this story will not die. The Odyssey is not verified history. Its monsters did not exist. Its gods did not intervene directly in human navigation. Its hero may or may not have been a real person. And the scholars who have spent lifetimes on the question have not resolved it. And yet for nearly 3,000 years, human beings have not been able to let it go. Because the Odyssey is not really about Polyphemus or Scylla or a bag of winds. It is about something far more stubborn and far more true. It is about what it feels like to be far from home, separated from the people you love, by distance and time and catastrophe you cannot fully control. It is about the seduction of forgetting. How easy it would be to stay on the Lotus Eaters' shore, to stop straining towards something painful and difficult, to simply feel nothing. It is about what pride costs, and what deception costs, and what the loss of your companions costs. It is about standing in your own hallway after 20 years, unrecognized, watching strangers eat your food. It is about Penelope, whose endurance is in some ways more extraordinary than Odysseus's, because she faced her trials without a goddess at her shoulder or a sword in her hand, with only intelligence and patience and the refusal to surrender something that might already be gone. Many historians believe the Odyssey was composed in a period when Greeks were themselves, navigating a post-collapse world, rebuilding civilization. After the Bronze Age catastrophe, sailing into unfamiliar waters of the Western Mediterranean as colonizers and traders, confronting the unknown. The poem gave mythological form to the terror and the wonder of that experience. It said, "The sea is dangerous and full of things that will kill you. Go anyway, keep going. Remember where you're going." The Homeric scholar Gregory Nagy and others in the field have described the Odyssey as the foundational expression of a Greek concept, nostos, that transcends its cultural moment. Every human being who has ever been displaced, exiled, separated from home by war or economics or time or grief, knows something of what Odysseus felt on that cliff above the sea. Every person who has ever been tempted to stop trying, to let the journey go, to accept a comfortable substitute for the life they actually wanted, knows the Lotus Eaters' island. And every person who has ever returned, after too long, to a place they left and been recognized by a single detail that only someone who truly knew them could have known, knows the moment of the olive tree bed. The moment the disguise falls away, the moment when all of it, every year of it, was worth it. The world has told many stories in 3,000 years. Stories of gods and kings and monsters and war. Most of them have faded. This one has not, because it is not, in the end, the story of a hero sailing across a mythological sea. It is the story of a human being who wanted more than immortality, more than ease, more than the absence of pain, to go home and who would not stop until he did. Homer ends his epic not with triumph, but with sleep. Odysseus finally at last in his own bed, in his own dark, on his own island, beside the woman he had sailed 20 years to find again. After everything, the monsters, the gods, the lost men, the long exile, the blood, it comes down to this: a man, a bed, a home, and somewhere in that simplest of endings, 3,000 years of human longing recognizes itself.